My Adventures in the Yemen.
Tracing the footsteps of the musicologist Hans Helfrich.
I had been thrown into prison like a common criminal, and the wildest rumors were circulating about me and the purpose of my journey. Day after day, the crowds collected in front of police headquarters, staring persistently up at my barred window. They thought I was an English spy. The idea that anyone would take upon himself all the dangers and difficulties of traversing the desert in the most arduous way to reach this remote country just for the sake of music and for the joy of adventure too, was quite beyond the comprehension of the Yemenites.
Many and various are the ways in which people become explorers. But there can hardly have been a more unusual motive than that of Hans Helfrich from Germany, the first European to set foot in the forbidden cities of the Hadramaut and the Yemen. The story of Hans Helfrich is one of the most astonishing in the annals of ethnology. It was neither archaeology nor wanderlust that drove him into the murderous wastes of South Arabia. It was music. He was not searching for ancient cities, but for old melodies. Before he became one of the greatest of modern-day explorers, Hans Helfrich studied composition and the double bass in Berlin. Since 1960, he's been living and working on Ibiza.
That's still a completely tonal piece. I wrote it when I was a young man of 25. Of course, I never dreamed at the time that I'd be playing it again in public at the age of 87. Later on, I composed in a quite different style. I was a pupil of Thyssen, Budding, and also of Hindemith. And my compositions were what was then called atonal. I wrote chamber and orchestral music, and also composed for films, for my own films, which I sold to Ufer in those days. I won first prize for a concerto I wrote for tenor saxophone and large orchestra at a music festival in Santiago de Chile. In the late 20s, I was studying at the Berlin Music Academy, composition under Franz Schenker and comparative music studies under Professor von Hornbostel. I had already made some recordings in Palestine, Syria, and Mesopotamia for Professor von Hornborstel. But we knew nothing at all about the music of South Arabia, because it was extremely difficult at the time to get into those countries at all. They were regarded as the least accessible areas in the world.
In 1933 and 1935, Hans Helfrich undertook 2 journeys to the Yemen that have since become legendary. On his dangerous expeditions, the young musicologist took with him 300 wax cylinders and an Edison phonograph for his ethnological recordings. The films he made in South Arabia with a handheld 35mm camera caused quite a sensation. Some of this black and white footage has survived, and we shall be showing some clips in the course of this film. Both Helfrich's expeditions started in Aden, taking the sea route to Makalla, and continued from there through Wadi Hadramaut and the towns of Tarim and Shibam to Shabwa, then on to Harib, Maghrib and Sana, and finally to Manakha and through the Tihama to the port city Hodeida on the Red Sea. In those days, Aden, along with Gibraltar, Malta and Cyprus, was one of the 4 military bases protecting the British Empire's most vital sea route. British officials and forces regarded it as hell on earth, and the bare volcanic rocks of this small peninsula are indeed bleak and desolate. Aden is not notable for its Arabian architecture. Its buildings and streets are in stark contrast to the cities of the hinterland. In days gone by, the ships of the Sabaeans used to put in here to unload the treasures of India and the Malayan islands, or prepare for new voyages to Sabaean outposts on the African coast.
Ibn el-Mokhabir, in his account of Arabia written in the year 1200, says, "The climate in Aden is so bad that within 10 days all wine turns to vinegar." A rather odd comment from a Mohammedan. I would have had to wait in Aden forever for an entry permit from Hadramaut if the British government hadn't given me permission to proceed to Makalla, with the proviso that I obtain my landing permit when I got there. So I took a chance and boarded the steamer to the Hadramaut. The town of Makalla, packed tightly into a narrow strip of land, seems to rise straight out of the sea before the background of a steep wall of mountains. It's a very old town that has served as a port for the Hadramaut for centuries. Fishing in the Indian Ocean is not as pleasant as here in the Mediterranean around Ibiza. There are numerous sharks, and the Indian Ocean sharks, particularly in the Gulf of Aden, are so dangerous that you can't even paddle barefoot in the shallows. And apart from the sharks, there are huge mantas, giant stingrays, swordfish, and many species of fish we don't know at all here. But the most important for the fishermen are not the big fish, but the very small sardine-like fish known as aitch. These aitch are washed in with the surf so close to the shore that the fishermen don't need nets. They simply scoop them up with baskets into their boats. In those days, the fish used to be dried on the beach, particularly in the Makalla area. But they don't always dry up in the sun. They sometimes decay in the hot, humid atmosphere, creating the most appalling stench. These fish are a great local delicacy, and they're not just eaten by humans, they're fed to the camels too. That's the reason why the fish are dried. People take large quantities of these aitch with them when travelling inland. And that's how it was on my journeys. We took sacks full of these stinking dried fish along, so that travelling in caravan, I had the pleasure of smelling dried fish day and night. In Makalla, I had to wait a long time before I found a caravan with Bedouin from the Tamimi tribe. The Tamimis were paid regularly by the Al-Kafs, because the Al-Kafs owned a lot of property in Indonesia. Every year, they chartered a steamship, loaded it up with all sorts of goods in Indonesia, and dispatched it to Makalla. The goods arriving in Makalla had to be transported inland. It's about 300 kilometers from the coast to Wadi Hadramaut, and in those days there were no roads or cars or trucks. The goods could only be taken by camel caravans. It was just such a caravan that I joined.
An einer solchen Karawane konnte ich mich dann anschließen.
The caravan moved off on a broad front, broken up into groups. Each group was a chain of at least 3, sometimes 5 or 6 camels. It's an odd thing with these animals. One can never form a personal relationship with them as one can with horses. They do their work silently and patiently, but they always seem to be wrapped in a cloud of disgruntlement. One could almost say they hate being camels, but at the same time despise all other living creatures, including human beings. When they're being loaded or have to get up, they gargle with rage, bare their long yellow teeth, and try to bite, even those who look after them and feed them. In spite of all their ugliness, their unsightly humps, the thick, horny pads on their overlong legs, the evil odor they exude, their sad eyes, rimmed with long, languishing eyelashes, are beautiful. They have a look of deep melancholy, mixed with reproach and contempt. The journey from Makalla into the Hadramaut takes 9 days. Often, the monotonous chant of the Bedouin is heard, the rhythm spinning out endlessly with slight variations. It seems to be gently rocking you as you're carried along. These songs are particularly strange, and they have probably evolved from the landscape itself, because they're songs with triadic melodies, which is unusual among the Bedouin. And these triadic melodies echo back in the narrow wadis, so that chords build up one upon the other. Perhaps this was the very reason they invented these triadic melodies, so that they could enjoy the echo, which resounds from the wadis like a great organ note. There are also old love songs to camels, but sometimes the Bedouins are really thinking of their lady loves. Nowadays, Wadi Hadramaut can be reached by plane or on busy roads. But in those days, there were only bridle paths, if anything at all. The Bedouin always found their way there. We took exactly 9 days from Makalla to Wadi Hadramaut, and we reached our destination on time.
The Hadramaut, that strange, recently rediscovered land, is a 200-kilometre-long valley lying about 160 kilometres from the coast. In the Bible, it's called Hazamareth. Pliny calls it elevated in the two senses of altitude and status. It must once have been very rich, since it was mainly from the Hadramaut that two products came which were both highly prized and highly priced in the whole of the ancient world: incense and myrrh. The spirit and creative force of the ancient people of Hadramaut gave birth to a culture which is still preserved in the style of its architecture. But what survives is only a remnant of the far more glorious past. Countless ruins, stretching for miles along the valleys and dating back to the pre-Christian era, testify to this past. Until a few decades ago, the Yemenites kept close guard over their country's archaeological secrets. As followers of Islam, they barred any attempt to investigate these fragments of a culture over 3,000 years old.